Victor James, do you understand the charges against you? Judge William Crawford's deep voice echoed through the courtroom. But Victor's mind was racing far too fast to process the question. The 16-year-old boy stood frozen, staring at the gavel in the judge's hand, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. How had his life come to this? A petty theft charge, a packed courtroom, and his mother in tears in the back row. The room fell silent, and every eye fixated on Victor as he finally muttered, "Yes, Your Honor." But what happened next shook the room like an earthquake. "I'm not just your judge," Crawford said, his voice cracking for the first time that anyone had ever heard in his 25 years on the bench. "Victor, I'm your father." The gasp that rippled through the courtroom was deafening. Victor's heart stopped, his body stiffened, and his head whipped toward his mother, Teresa. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't deny it. "You're lying," Victor shouted, the words flying out of his mouth before he could think. "What the hell are you talking about?" Judge Crawford set the gavel down, his face etched with an unreadable expression. "I've made mistakes in my life, Victor. I'm sorry you're finding out this way, but it's the truth." Victor's knees felt weak. The room spun. This couldn't be happening. "Mom," he stammered, his voice breaking. "Is he telling the truth?" Teresa's silence was louder than any answer she could have given. She slumped in her chair, tears spilling down her cheeks. Victor stumbled back, his breathing ragged. Everything about his life suddenly felt like a lie. His mind flashed back to every struggle, every hungry night, every time his mother had worked double shifts to make ends meet. And now, the man who had lived in wealth and power all this time dared to call himself his father? "I don't need you," Victor hissed through clenched teeth. "You're not my real dad." The judge's face crumbled as the bailiff tried to regain control of the chaotic courtroom. But Victor wasn't waiting around to hear any more lies. He bolted out of the room, his mind swirling with confusion, rage, and betrayal. Outside, the cameras were already flashing, reporters shouting questions. Victor's world had been turned upside down, and this was just the beginning. Victor slammed the apartment door so hard it rattled the walls. "Mom!" he shouted, his voice raw with fury. "You've got 5 seconds to explain what the hell just happened in that courtroom." Teresa Harris sat on the worn couch, her head in her hands, refusing to meet his gaze. Her silence stoked Victor's anger. "So it's true?" he demanded, pacing like a caged animal. "That man, the judge, is my father? You lied to me my entire life." She finally looked up, her tear-streaked face full of pain. "It's not that simple, Victor. Not that simple?" Victor spat the words, his voice rising. "I've spent my whole life thinking my dad was dead, that he wasn't in the picture because he couldn't be. But he's alive? And not just alive, he's some rich, powerful judge? You've been lying to me since the day I was born." Teresa stood, trembling but resolute. "I did what I had to do to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Victor shouted, his chest heaving. "The truth? Or from him?" Teresa's lips parted as if she were about to speak, but the knock at the door interrupted them. Both mother and son froze. "Victor!" The voice from the other side of the door sent a chill down his spine. It was Judge Crawford. "I know you're angry, but please, let me explain." Victor's jaw clenched as he turned to his mother. "You let him come here?" "I didn't know," Teresa whispered, panic flashing in her eyes. Victor stormed to the door and swung it open. Crawford stood there, looking smaller than he ever had in the courtroom, his usual commanding presence replaced with hesitation. "Get out," Victor snarled. "Just give me 5 minutes," Crawford pleaded, his hands raised. "You deserve to know the truth." "I deserve." Victor cut him off, his voice dripping with venom. "Where was this sense of responsibility when I was growing up in the projects? When my mom was breaking her back to keep food on the table? You don't get to waltz in here now and pretend you care." Crawford's face fell. "I know I failed you, but I'm here now." "Too late," Victor said coldly, slamming the door in his face. The silence that followed was suffocating. Teresa sank back onto the couch, her hands shaking. Victor stared at her, his voice breaking as he asked, "Why did you hide him from me? Tell me the truth, Mom. All of it." And for the first time, Teresa began to tell the story she had been running from for 16 years. Victor sat stiffly on the couch, his arms crossed, his jaw tight as he stared at his mother. "Start talking," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Teresa took a deep, shuddering breath, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her worn sweater. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I worked for Judge Crawford a long time ago. I was his housekeeper when I was in my early 20s. Victor raised an eyebrow. You were his housekeeper? That's the big secret. She shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. It's not just that, Victor. We had a relationship. The words hit Victor like a punch to the gut. A relationship? With him? Mom, are you serious? How could you? It wasn't what you think. Teresa snapped, her voice trembling with both anger and pain. I was young, broke, and desperate for work. He had all the power, Victor. I didn't have a choice. Victor froze, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. What do you mean you didn't have a choice? Her voice cracked as she continued. He made promises, said he'd help me, take care of me. But when I got pregnant, everything changed. He told me he couldn't afford the scandal. Said his career would be over if anyone found out. He offered me money to disappear, but I refused. I wasn't going to let him buy me off. So I left. Victor's chest tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. So he just abandoned you? And me? Teresa nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't tell anyone who your father was. I didn't want you to grow up knowing that your dad turned his back on you. I thought it was better that way. Victor felt like the floor was falling out from under him. So all this time, I've been nothing to him. And now, out of nowhere, he decides to tell the world I'm his son? Why? Teresa shook her head, her expression as bewildered as his. I don't know. Maybe he feels guilty. Maybe he's trying to fix his mistakes. But whatever his reasons, it doesn't change the fact that he wasn't there when we needed him. Victor's stomach churned. The father he had dreamed of as a child, the strong, kind man who would one day come back for him, was nothing more than a selfish coward. He stood abruptly, his fists clenched. I don't care what his reasons are. He's not my dad. He's just a stranger who ruined your life and walked away. Teresa reached out to him, her voice trembling. Victor, I know this is a lot to take in, but don't let his mistakes define you. You're better than him. Victor turned toward the door, his jaw set. I need some air. As he walked out into the night, the weight of the truth pressed down on him like a storm cloud. He didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was certain. Judge Crawford wasn't his father. Not really. Not where it mattered. The morning after the courtroom revelation, Victor woke to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. Groggy and still reeling from his mother's confession, he squinted at the screen. His social media accounts were flooded, comments, friend requests, and messages from people he didn't even know. He opened one message from a classmate. Yo, Victor, you're trending. Judge's secret love child? Crazy stuff, man. Victor's heart sank. A quick search confirmed his worst fear. His face was everywhere. Every news outlet in town had run the story. The headlines were humiliating. Respected judge reveals hidden son in courtroom drama. Victor James. From juvenile delinquent to judge's love child. Scandal at the bench. Crawford's illegitimate son exposed. Victor's stomach twisted as he read the comments. Bet he's just using this to get out of trouble. Kids like him don't deserve a second chance, no matter who his dad is. Typical gold digger. Watch him milk the judge for everything. He threw the phone down, his chest tight with anger and embarrassment. How had his life spiraled so far out of control in less than 24 hours? A loud knock at the door startled him. When he opened it, he found two reporters on the front steps with microphones and cameras. Victor, what's your reaction to Judge Crawford's announcement? One asked. He slammed the door in their faces. Mom! He yelled, storming into the living room. Teresa was sitting at the kitchen table, her head buried in her hands. She looked up, her face lined with exhaustion. They're outside, Victor said, pacing the room. They're treating me like some circus act. I know, Teresa said softly. I told you this is why I kept his identity a secret. I didn't want this for you. Well, congratulations, Victor snapped. It's all out in the open now. Everyone thinks I'm some loser who's riding his dad's coattails. Before Teresa could respond, another knock came. This time it wasn't reporters, it was Judge Crawford himself. Victor's blood boiled. He swung the door open, glaring at the man who had turned his life upside down. Are you here to fix this? Or to make it worse? Crawford's expression was solemn. I just want to talk, Victor. I can help. Victor laughed bitterly. Help? You've done nothing but ruin my life. Just leave me alone. Behind him, Teresa spoke up. Victor, maybe you should listen. Victor turned to her, his face twisted with betrayal. Listen? To him? He's the reason we've been struggling for 16 years. Crawford raised his hands in surrender. I can't change the past, but I want to take responsibility now. Victor shook his head, his voice low and sharp. You don't get to take responsibility now. You had your chance and you blew it. Slamming the door once again, Victor leaned against it, his breathing heavy. Outside, the reporters continued to swarm, shouting questions, snapping pictures, turning his life into a spectacle. He retreated to his room, staring at the headlines again. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. The anger, the shame, the confusion. It was all too much. For the first time in his life, Victor didn't know who he was anymore. And worse, he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. Judge William Crawford sat in his car outside Victor's apartment building, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had thought that revealing the truth in court would somehow be cathartic, that owning up to his past would open the door to a better future. Instead, he had shattered everything: Victor's life, his own reputation, and whatever fragile trust might have existed. As he stared at the rundown building, a flood of memories came rushing back. He remembered Teresa, young and vibrant, full of fire even in the face of struggle. He remembered the promises he'd made to her, promises he'd broken the moment his ambition took precedence over responsibility. Now that boy, Victor, his son, was suffering because of his cowardice. With a heavy sigh, he stepped out of the car. This time, he wasn't going to knock on the door and beg for forgiveness. He had a plan. Meanwhile, Victor was spiraling. He hadn't left the apartment in 2 days, ignoring the constant knocks from reporters and the text messages from his friends. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like his life no longer belonged to him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Crawford's face, heard his voice saying, "I'm your father." The words echoed in his head like a curse. A sharp knock at the door jolted him out of his thoughts. He groaned, assuming it was another reporter, but Teresa's voice called out, "Victor, it's for you. You need to hear this." Dragging himself to the door, he opened it to find Crawford standing there, not with excuses but with a folder in his hand. "Please," Crawford said softly, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "I just need a moment." Victor narrowed his eyes. "Why can't you just leave me alone?" "I'm not here to force anything on you," Crawford said, holding out the folder. "But I want you to know that I've been thinking about what I owe you." Victor hesitated before snatching the folder. Inside, he found documents, financial support arrangements, college funds, even a detailed plan to donate a portion of his wealth to programs in Victor's neighborhood. "I don't need your money," Victor snapped, throwing the folder back at Crawford. "It's not just money," Crawford said, his voice breaking. "It's me trying to make up for the years I wasn't there. I know I'll never be the father you deserved, but I want to be someone you can depend on." Victor's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to tell this man that no amount of money or promises could erase the pain he'd caused. But deep down, there was a flicker of something else, curiosity, perhaps even hope. "You think this will fix everything?" Victor said bitterly. "No," Crawford admitted. "I don't. But it's a start." Victor didn't reply. He just stared at the man in front of him, unsure if he should slam the door again or let this conversation play out. Later that night, Victor found himself sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through the documents. Teresa watched him from across the room, her eyes filled with worry. "You don't have to accept anything from him, Victor," she said softly. Victor looked up, his expression unreadable. "I'm not sure what I want," he admitted. "But for the first time, it feels like he's the one trying, not just me and you." Teresa nodded, but her face remained guarded. "Just be careful. He's still the same man who left us when it mattered most." Victor didn't respond. He didn't know what to believe anymore. All he knew was that Crawford's sudden effort stirred something deep inside him: anger, confusion, and the faintest glimmer of a desire for answers. As he stared at the folder again, Victor realized that the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Victor felt the tension building inside him like a ticking time bomb. Days had passed since Crawford's visit, and the man's promises weighed heavily on his mind. The documents sat untouched on the corner of the kitchen table, a constant reminder of the chaos his life had become. But anger continued to consume him. Crawford's sudden attempts at redemption felt hollow, like a bandage slapped over an open wound. Victor couldn't shake the feeling that he was being used, just another project for the judge to fix, so he could sleep better at night. That anger finally boiled over one evening when Victor got caught up with his new group of friends. Older boys from the neighborhood who didn't care about courtroom scandals or judges' sons. They made him feel normal, even if their version of normal was dangerous. "Come on, Vic." One of the boys, Dante, said with a sly grin as they loitered outside a corner store. You said you wanted to blow off some steam, right? Let's make it interesting. Victor hesitated as Dante gestured toward the store. He knew where this was headed, but the adrenaline rushing through him drowned out his better judgment. Let's do it, Victor muttered, shoving his hands into his hoodie pockets. Minutes later, the store clerk was yelling, chasing the boys out into the night. Victor's heart pounded as they sprinted down an alley, his stolen candy bars still clutched in his hands. The rush was fleeting, though, because the moment they turned the corner, a squad car was waiting for them. The handcuffs felt cold and humiliating as Victor sat in the back of the police car, staring at the ground. His mother's face flashed in his mind, disappointed, exhausted, heartbroken. And then, to his horror, another face appeared, Judge Crawford. At the station, Victor slumped in the holding cell, his head in his hands. He didn't even fight back when the officer lectured him about kids who don't appreciate second chances. He was too drained, too angry at himself for making everything worse. But the nightmare wasn't over. When the cell door opened, it wasn't Teresa who walked in. It was Crawford. Victor shot to his feet, his eyes blazing. What are you doing here? Crawford didn't flinch. I'm here to make sure you don't ruin your life before it even starts. I didn't ask you to come, Victor shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. I know, Crawford said quietly, but I couldn't just sit back and watch this happen. Victor laughed bitterly, pacing like a caged animal. You don't get it, do you? You think showing up here makes you some kind of hero? You think this erases everything you've done? Or didn't do? Crawford stepped closer, his voice firm but calm. I don't think I'm a hero, Victor. I know I've failed you in every way a father can fail his son. But I'm not giving up on you, no matter how much you hate me. Victor's chest heaved, his emotions tangled in a knot too tight to unravel. I don't need you, he spat. I've been fine without you my whole life. Why can't you just leave me alone? Because I care, Crawford said simply. I care enough to be here, even when you're pushing me away. Victor turned his back to him, fists clenched. He wanted to scream, to hit something, to make Crawford feel a fraction of the pain he had carried all these years. But instead, he said nothing. Later that night, Teresa picked him up from the station. She didn't yell or scold him. Her silence was punishment enough. As they drove home, Victor stared out the window, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. Crawford had bailed him out. Again. But was it out of guilt, or was it something more? Victor didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep running forever. Victor sat in silence at the kitchen table, the documents Crawford had left still lying untouched in front of him. The dim light above flickered slightly, casting uneasy shadows across the room. Teresa stood by the stove, her back to him, but Victor could feel her tension, like she was bracing for the storm she knew was coming. Mom, he said finally, his voice low but sharp, you need to tell me everything. All of it. No more half-truths. No more excuses. Teresa froze for a moment, her hand gripping the counter for support. When she turned to face him, her expression was a mix of guilt and pain. You already know the big pieces, Victor, she said softly. I don't know what else you want me to say. I want to know why you let him get away with it. Victor snapped, his voice rising. Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you make him take responsibility? Instead, you just let him disappear while we struggled. Teresa sighed deeply, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the past had finally become too heavy to carry. I tried to fight back, Victor, she said, her voice trembling. But I was just a young, scared girl. He was powerful, respected. Everyone saw him as this perfect, untouchable man, and no one would have believed me. Victor's fists clenched. So what? You just gave up? No, she said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. I didn't give up. I walked away to protect you. If I had stayed, if I had tried to force him to be a part of your life, it would have destroyed us both. He would have used his money, his connections, his power to make sure we were silenced. I couldn't let that happen. Victor leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. So you let him go because you were scared. And now he gets to come back whenever he wants. Act like he's some kind of savior, and I'm just supposed to forgive him. Teresa shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to think about what you want, not what I wanted, not what he wants. This is your life, Victor. You get to decide what kind of relationship, if any, you have with him. Victor was silent, the anger simmering beneath his skin, warring with the confusion and pain that refused to leave him alone. Do you hate him? He asked finally. Teresa's face softened, her voice quiet. I don't know. Some days I do. Some days I feel sorry for him. But mostly, I just want to move on. I don't want him to have power over me anymore. Victor stared at her, his chest heavy. Her words hit something deep inside him. Power. That's what this was really about. Crawford had power. Over her. Over him. Even now, after all these years, he was still pulling the strings, whether he meant to or not. I don't know if I can forgive him either, Victor said finally. But I can't keep letting him control my life. Teresa reached across the table and took his hand. Then don't. Take the power back, Victor. On your terms. Victor nodded slowly, her words sinking in. For the first time, he felt like he had a choice. Crawford wasn't some untouchable figure anymore. He was just a man. A flawed, broken man who had left a trail of pain in his wake. And Victor wasn't going to let him dictate his life anymore. As the night stretched on, Victor sat alone, staring out the window at the city lights. His mind was clearer now, but the path ahead was still uncertain. One thing, however, was certain. The confrontation he had been avoiding was inevitable. And this time he wouldn't back down. Victor stood outside the courthouse, his hands jammed deep in his hoodie pockets, his breath fogging in the crisp morning air. He stared up at the imposing building, its stone columns gleaming under the sunlight, and felt a knot of anxiety twist in his stomach. This place had always been a symbol of power, power that had been used to crush him, to silence his mother, and to protect the man inside. But not today. Today, Victor wasn't here as a defendant or a victim. He was here on his own terms. He took a deep breath and pushed through the heavy doors. The bustling sound of footsteps and murmurs filled the hall as he made his way to Judge Crawford's chambers. A part of him still didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't keep running from this. Crawford looked up from his desk when Victor walked in. His expression shifted from surprise to something softer. Relief, maybe. Victor, he said, standing. I didn't expect to see you here. Victor stayed by the door, his arms crossed. I'm not here for a reunion. I just need to get a few things off my chest. Crawford nodded slowly, motioning toward a chair. Take a seat if you'd like. Victor shook his head. No, I'll stand. He hesitated for a moment, then began. For 16 years, you didn't care about me. Not once. You left my mom to raise me on her own, and now you want to swoop in like some kind of savior. Crawford's face tightened. Victor, I'm not trying to. Let me finish. Victor interrupted, his voice firm. I've spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't enough. Why you didn't want me. Why my mom had to struggle while you lived in your big house, pretending we didn't exist. And now that you've finally decided to admit the truth, you think throwing some money around will fix everything. Crawford's shoulders sagged, his expression raw with guilt. I don't expect forgiveness, Victor. I don't even deserve it. But I want to do better. For you, for your future. Victor laughed bitterly. You think this is about what you want? You're not the victim here. You're not the hero either. You're just a man who made choices, and those choices hurt people. I can't undo the past, and neither can you. Crawford nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. You're right. I failed you in more ways than I can count. But I don't want to fail you again. Even if you hate me, even if you never speak to me again, I'm going to be here. I'll support you however I can. You deserve that much. Victor was silent for a long moment, his emotions a chaotic mix of anger, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said finally, but I'm done letting you live rent-free in my head. You don't get to control my life anymore. Crawford nodded. That's fair. All I ask is that you let me prove myself, at your pace, on your terms. Victor stared at him, searching for any hint of insincerity. To his surprise, he found none. Weeks passed, and though Victor still carried the weight of his past, he began to focus on his future. He returned to school, started working toward his goals, and even opened the college fund Crawford had set up. It didn't erase the pain, but it was a step forward. One evening, Victor found himself sitting on a park bench, looking out at the city skyline. His phone buzzed. A text from Crawford. No pressure, but I'm here if you ever want to talk. Victor stared at the message for a long time before typing a single reply. Maybe one day. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like it belonged to him. And that was enough.